Everything you've been told is lie, because the idea that smart solutions always look smart at the beginning is one of the biggest myths in history. And in the winter village of Hälsingland, Sweden, in the early 1800s, one quiet farmer named John Anderson of Bommersgården learned this the hard way, when he decided to do something so strange that people stopped him in the road just to stare. Because instead of building a bigger house or a new barn like everyone else, he slowly began building a long wooden shed around his house, wrapping it on all sides like a coat, plank by plank, until his neighbors started whispering that he had finally lost his mind, since no one in the village had ever seen a man waste good timber enclosing a perfectly fine home. And in a place where wood was precious and winters were brutal, wasting effort was considered almost a moral failure. So the laughter came as only, especially when the outer structure grew wider and deeper, forming a continuous covered gallery that blocked the wind and created long dry corridors. Because to the villagers, it looked like John was hiding his house instead of improving it, and some even joked that he was afraid of the cold air itself. But what most people did not understand was that John was not building for appearance, pride, or fashion. He was building for winter, the kind of winter that lasted 6 months, froze lakes solid, cracked door frames, and destroyed firewood faster than hunger destroyed patience. Because in Hälsingland, the real enemy was not snow, but wet wood, since damp firewood smoked badly, burned poorly, and wasted precious heat. And every year, families lost weeks of warmth because their carefully chopped logs absorbed moisture from snow and wind, turning fuel into useless weight. And John had watched this happen his whole life, watching neighbors haul frozen, half-rotten logs into their homes, coughing as smoke filled the rooms, while he quietly calculated how much heat was being lost before the fire even started. And so instead of building another shed far from the house like tradition demanded, he broke custom and joined everything together, creating a protective wooden ring that allowed him to store firewood right against the house, fully covered, raised off the ground, protected from snow, and close enough to reach without stepping into a storm. But innovation is rarely welcomed when it looks strange. And as weeks passed, the jokes grew sharper. Children dared each other to run through the gallery. Elders shook their heads and said John was wasting his inheritance. And even visiting traders laughed and said no house should wear a coat thicker than its owner. Yet, John said very little, because he understood something history repeats again and again, that the people who laugh first are often the ones who freeze later. And as autumn faded and the first heavy snows arrived, the village settled into its long darkness, still amused by the man who built a shed around his home, unaware that the real test had not even begun yet. And as temperatures dropped lower each night and the wind started howling through the valley, something quietly different was happening behind John Anderson's wooden walls, something no one noticed, but everyone would soon feel, because winter was only just opening the door, and the laughter was about to stop. If this kind of forgotten history surprises you, stay with the story and subscribe. Because what happened next changed how people in this region built their homes for generations. Everything you've been told is lie. Because progress does not announce itself with applause. It arrives silently, often wrapped in ridicule. In the winter of 1812 in Hälsingland arrived colder and longer than anyone expected, locking the countryside in ice so deep that sleds replaced footsteps and even seasoned farmers began rationing heat. Because firewood that had looked fine in autumn now sat frozen under snowbanks, soaked from melting ice, and every strike of the axe revealed damp, useless cores. While smoke-filled rooms became common, and families burned twice as much wood for half the warmth. Yet, at Bommersgården, something unusual was happening. Because John Anderson's fire burned steady and clean, day after day, with no coughing smoke and no desperate midnight trips through blizzards, since his firewood sat dry inside the long outer gallery that wrapped his home, protected from moisture by the roof above and the warmth of the house beside it, slowly air-drying all winter. And when neighbors finally noticed, it was not because John bragged, but because his chimneys smoked less, his windows stayed clearer, and his family did not retreat early into bed to conserve heat, and curiosity, which always follows comfort, began to replace mockery. As villagers started stopping by under excuses of borrowed tools or friendly visits, only to notice the dry logs stacked neatly along the walls, easy to reach, light to carry, and ready to burn. While their own supplies back home were turning black with rot, and one by one they began asking questions. Quietly at first, because pride freezes harder than water, and John answered honestly, explaining how the enclosed outer structure, known locally as a wood gallery, blocked wind, stopped snow, and kept logs dry while using no extra land and very little extra material. Since it also strengthened the house against cold air, reducing heat loss, something modern builders would later call insulation, though John simply called it common sense. And as weeks passed, The same men who once laughed now measured his walls with their eyes. Counting boards, calculating costs, and one by one they began asking questions, quietly at first, because pride freezes harder than water. And John answered honestly, explaining how the enclosed outer structure, known locally as a wood gallery, blocked wind, stopped snow, and kept logs dry while using no extra land and very little extra material. Since it also strengthened the house against cold air, reducing heat loss, something modern builders would later call insulation, though John simply called it common sense. And as weeks passed, the same men who once laughed now measured his walls with their eyes. Counting boards, calculating costs, and when a midwinter storm collapsed several exposed woodsheds across the valley, destroying entire fuel stores overnight, the truth became impossible to ignore, because John's firewood stayed untouched, dry, and ready, while others scrambled for emergency supplies, paying high prices or cutting green wood that burned badly, and by late winter, the jokes had vanished completely, replaced by something far rarer in human history, quiet admission of being wrong. And by spring, when the snow finally retreated and the village emerged thinner, colder, but wiser, several families began adding their own enclosed galleries. Not copying John's house exactly, but borrowing the idea that had saved him months of comfort and energy. And what had once been called foolish now became known as practical. Even traditional, passed down to the next generation as the Hälsingland way, without mentioning how fiercely it was once mocked, because history often forgets laughter but remembers survival. And long after John Anderson passed away, his home remained, preserved, studied, and eventually recognized as part of a unique building tradition so effective that it earned UNESCO recognition centuries later. Not because it was beautiful, but because it worked. And yet the most important part of the story is not the wood or the walls, but how easily people dismiss ideas that challenge habit, even when those ideas stand between them and the cold. If this story is changing how you think about old knowledge, like the video and keep watching, because the final lesson may feel uncomfortably familiar today. Everything you've been told is lie, because the past was not a collection of simple people making simple choices. It was filled with quiet innovators, like John Anderson of Hälsingland, whose solutions were born not from textbooks, but from watching problems repeat year after year, and choosing to solve them even when it meant standing alone. And the reason this story still matters is because it exposes a pattern that never changes, where new ideas that look strange are laughed at, not because they are wrong, but because they disrupt comfort, routine, and pride. And when John built a shed around his house, he was not trying to be different. He was trying to stay warm, but the village saw a difference before it saw logic. And that mistake cost them heat, effort, and suffering, until winter forced honesty. And this same pattern appears again and again across history, from farming methods to architecture to technology, where solutions that work are rejected simply because they look unfamiliar. And what makes John's story powerful is that it is not heroic or dramatic. There is no battle or speech, just a man stacking dry firewood while others laughed, and then surviving winter more comfortably than anyone else. And today, his house still stands as part of the decorated farmhouses of Hälsingland, studied by historians and architects who now praise the efficiency and environmental wisdom of designs once mocked, noting how the enclosed gallery reduced fuel use, protected materials, and extended the life of the home. Long before modern sustainability became a buzzword, and if you listen closely, you can almost hear the echo of those early laughs fading into silence as the fire crackled warmly inside. Because history does not reward the loudest voice in the room, it rewards the one that works when conditions get hard. And the real question this story leaves us with is uncomfortable. Because it asks, how many smart solutions today are being ignored, delayed, or mocked simply because they do not fit what we expect progress to look like? And how many winters, literal or metaphorical, we are willing to suffer before admitting someone building differently might be right? And that is why John Anderson's shed matters. Not as a strange building, but as a warning carved into wood and time, reminding us that laughter is cheap, but warmth is earned. And the next time you see someone doing something that looks foolish at first glance, remember Hälsingland, remember the dry firewood, and remember how quickly mockery melts when reality freezes in. If you want more real history like this, stories that were laughed at before they were proven right, subscribe now. Because the next forgotten lesson may already be repeating itself around us.